Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar from TCC, Momenta and Recordsure, covering a recent ruling from the Supreme Court on motor finance commission arrangements. My name is Gary Evans. I am the Chief Product Officer and Chief Commercial Officer for TCC Group, incorporating both Momenta and Recordsure. And I'm joined today by my two colleagues, Gary Maud, who's a highly experienced regulatory consultant and practitioner and who heads up the TCC advisory function, and Mike Morris, the head of operations at Momenta, who's delivered countless remediation programs and has been preparing for the DCA remediation and redress program for more than 18 months. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping rules. The Q&A function on Zoom is available to everybody. Please feel free as we progress through the webinar to use it if you have any questions. Hopefully, we'll have some time at the end to answer them, but if not, we'll follow up with an email shortly afterwards. And secondly, we are going to be running some anonymous polls throughout this webinar. We're really keen to get your views on how you're feeling given the news of the last 2 weeks. But I want to reassure you that there's no way for us to attribute any answers to you individually or to your firm, and so these polls truly are anonymous. The purpose of this webinar is to provide an overview of the Supreme Court ruling and the subsequent FCA commentary, but only as context, since this has been covered several times in the past week by law firms. The more interesting elements of today will be the TCC Momenta House views on what the ruling will mean for the shape and size of the remediation and redress programs and the implications on operational teams and customers. In addition to that, we will also look to provide some guidance on what motor finance creditors need to do now in advance of the October paper from the FCA that should hopefully, finally, bring clarity. We're going to start today with a recap of the facts of the Supreme Court ruling on DCA and the FCA's commentary and plans. Gary, can I hand over to you, please?
Absolutely. Yeah. On Sunday, 3rd of August, the FCA confirmed it was consulting on a compensation scheme, which we mostly, I guess, on the call all know, seeking to provide redress to consumers who were treated unfairly when they took out motor finance. And that announcement followed the Supreme Court's landmark ruling on those 3 cases, which we are equally aware of. That had concluded commission payments to car dealers were unlawful and which had some potential wider connotations for commission arrangements in general. Now, the Supreme Court overturned 2 of those cases, how in one case, which I believe was the Johnson case, the Supreme Court ruled that due to the particular circumstances of the case, the commission arrangements resulted in an unfair relationship between the consumer and the lender under the Consumer Credit Act, and therefore the commission was unlawful. Now, it's clear the FCA believes that a formal compensation scheme is the best way forward, but they've still to provide clarity and certainty to firms and investors as quickly as possible, which should hopefully give us some consistency going forward in terms of how we're going to handle claims and how we're going to handle those complaints which have built up over the last year. So the FCA have committed to publishing a consultation paper by early October 25, which will set out proposals for a compensation scheme, and the FCA anticipates that the scheme will be finalised in time for complainants to start receiving compensation next year. But from speaking to some of you on the call, we're aware of the volumes of complaints you've had. And we're also aware how difficult it can be for you in terms of provisioning this exercise, and what is possibly going to happen going forward. So the FCA has stated they'll probably propose a scheme that covers discretionary commission arrangements with some further dialogue in this webinar around opt-in and opt-out implications.
Thanks, Gary. So before we go into some of the detail of what else the Supreme Court opined on, I want to pose a question to our webinar audience about how you felt after the long-awaited ruling. Did the kind of overruling of 2 of the cases and the narrowing of the focus on Johnson make you feel more or less comfortable than before? Diane, would you put our first poll up ahead of me already? So we'll give you kind of 10-15 seconds in the audience to vote on that. And then we will show the results. I'm assuming you were ready on your mice. Dan, I think we can probably close that one now, and let's take a look at the results. Well, that's interesting. There's a real balance there. I guess there's the seesaw effect of what is expected to be a much lower redress value expectation, which will give some boards some relief on the one side, with the additional complexity of having to triage and manage all of that non-DCA complaints on the other side. It does muddy the water, and I suppose it makes it so that it's not all good news, and that does appear to be how our audience is finding it. That's a nice segue, actually, into talking a bit more about the complexity of the unfair practices the Supreme Court talked about at length, and the implications for the stakeholders in the remediation process as a result. Gary, can I get you to opine on that one?
Yeah, very quickly. The Supreme Court ruled that in many cases commission payments could be legal, but also that in circumstances yet to be prescribed and which wasn't part of their deliberation may not be fair. So, for example, in the case of Johnson, the size of the commission paid and the manner in which it was disclosed in terms of transparency led to the conclusion that the relationship was unfair. The Supreme Court stated, as many of us will know, that several factors could indicate an unfair relationship and contravene the CCA, whilst equally recognising it depends on the facets of each case individually, which is very helpful when someone like Mike is trying to set up a process for a past business review. And just for those who aren't aware, the factors could include the size of the commission. I believe Johnson was 55% relative to the charge of credit, the nature of commission, whether it's discretionary or non, the characteristics of the consumer. Again, does that imply that some customers would be excludable because they're sophisticated? All these things we're yet to learn. Compliance with regulatory rules. Interesting in this point in this case that you could argue it was compliant in terms of disclosure, but the transparency, placement, etc., of the actual disclosure was what caused the scrutiny, hence the extent and manner of the disclosure. The FCA will now have to consider the above when deciding which cases should fall within the scope of a redress scheme. Unlikely that's going to be straightforward, in our opinion, not least things like opt-in, opt-out. When I read this, and we spoke to a number of our legal contacts, it felt as though whether or not that be Treasury pressure or influence, the FCA was looking to reduce the cost and reduce the burden on lenders by way of an approach to this. However, when Mike and I spoke about this recently, we're just wondering if it's in some ways the opposite, because you're having to upskill the type of people doing that work. So there are those type of considerations, not least when does commission stop being fair and becomes unfair? Is there a pivot point, etc., etc.? So FCA now committed to do a consultation for October 25. Beyond this, the FCA anticipates that scheme will be finalised in time for complainants to start receiving compensation scheme next year. And whether it be opt-in, opt-out, combination of the two, depending on circumstances, I think will be really interesting for those of you who've got backlogs of complaints, and whether or not you can carve any of those out, or whether or not they have to stay in pending some other type of approach the FCA have yet to prescribe. Do you want to carry on this point, Gary, or are you going to?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So if we look at the implications for stakeholders, what might that be? So for creditors, there's going to be a much larger potential for exceptions in the population, a lot more work to determine where a complaint has a case. For consumers, a lot more confusion about whether they qualify for a payment. Do they have to opt in if they've made a complaint already, etc.? Are they going to have to try their luck via CMCs if some PBRs are unclear, too aggressive, lack of consistency in approach across the industry? For CMCs, is this a lifeline back into motor finance again? I personally got the impression the FCA were trying to discourage customers from using CMCs where possible to ensure a smoother process for all. New complaints will be filled potentially with time-consuming DSAR requests by CMCs. who want to dispute your outcomes. And for brokers, car dealerships, there's now perhaps got to be a refreshed review of fair value assessment from a consumer duty lens, and looking again at the B2B2C relationship. CMC focus will be split between creditors and those at the end of the commission payment. So overall, I can't help thinking there are going to be a big need for complaint handlers for anyone with a backlog of complaints. Over to you, Gary.
Thanks, Gary. So on that basis then, where we expect a kind of lower redress provision overall because of the exclusion of kind of non-DCA as a kind of an en masse blanket kind of opt-in, but the greater complexity in having to assess the complaints. I want to run a second poll now, if that's okay, based on the cost and time required to conduct the remediation process. What impact did this ruling have on the likely cost of remediation if you exclude the actual redress payments to the clients? And we'll give you kind of 10, 20 seconds to have a think about that one, as I've given you lots of options with lots of numbers in there. Well, I think that would be great, Diane. If we can see the results. Wow. I guess the kind of just over a third of you struggling to quantify might be the reason why there's such a split across all of these. I'm certainly from what we've been looking at and we've been seeing, I think the piece that Gary called out there on kind of resource is going to be a really interesting challenge for the industry. But I'm not the best person to talk about that. Mike, you were all primed and ready to go, weren't you, based on what we thought was going to happen? So what is your expectation now on firstly how the remediation would have looked operationally before the ruling, and then what is changing given what we have heard?
Thanks, Gary. So I think that probably the main change is around previously we were expecting a auto redress scheme that would cover DCA cases and potentially non-DCA cases, and that would be relatively straightforward in terms of describing a simple process that could be automated using technology to push through maybe 75–80% upwards of that population through a workflow system that completes the process steps from tracing through to redress through to contacting customers. For the populations outside of that, there would be some exceptions. So potentially where there's key data that's missing from the customer's file, collections activity might have taken place, vulnerability flags, deceased customers. Now those would go down a sort of a non-happy path, and you would need a more tailored and bespoke process that human resources would need to be working. So I think the main change that we can see is that the volume of cases that are in scope for that automated redress population is lower, but due to the issues that the Supreme Court has raised around unfair practices, it does mean there is now potentially a higher volume of cases that sit outside auto redress, and those case types are going to be more complex to review. We know through CMC behaviour with existing clients and providers that the CMCs will make it more complex. They will find additional complaint points to put into those cases that will need to be triaged and identified. And it's a more nuanced decision-making process. So the ultimate result of that is you would need sort of more experienced resources to be able to process that. I think the point there is that the redress cost to firms in terms of the payments they're making to customers is lower, but overall the potential for the remediation, the processing costs of the remediation is likely to be higher.
That's really helpful, Mike. Thank you. Now, since the ruling on the 3rd, we've seen some significant movement from a number of motor finance creditors to start engaging in procurement exercises ahead of the kind of complete clarity of scope and process from the FCA. And that seems to be based on a feel that getting access to the right type of resource may well be in very high demand and very difficult if everybody is trying to do it at the same time. So I want to run a quick third poll, if that's okay, to see how this audience is feeling about their readiness. Kind of what stage of planning are you at for what will obviously kind of inevitably result in a remediation and redress project? I do wonder whether we're going to get a similar split of opinions as we have done on the last two questions. Thanks, Diane. I think that's probably covered us. Interesting. So whilst we have had a large number of respondees on this one, more than half not even started, and kind of most of the rest of you are kind of at the initial preparation stage. We are certainly seeing, I guess we would, because of the conversations we've been having, more of the people in the bottom half of that of that scheme, with a number of RFPs currently being worked on, and a couple of clients of ours who have been in this for a while. Well, that's great. Thank you, Dan. Now we talked a little bit about resourcing, but Mike, there's a lot of delivery organisations ready to move on these projects already. So be at the big four, some of the big legal firms with servicing arms, business process outsourcers, and kind of more specialised compliance consultancies and professional services business. Do they all have this kind of individual pool of qualified resources to deliver these projects, so they can be kind of spread out across the industry, or are they all fishing in the same associate pool?
So I think the typical types of resources needed for sort of the more straightforward DCA process, you're looking at entry-level case handlers, and the market is quite full in terms of that level of experience. But when you start getting into the complex work, looking at the unfair practices, it is more specialised and requires more experience in terms of assessing the fairness and customer circumstances and details around the sale. We foresee that there's going to be a higher demand for those resources. You know, all motor finance firms with a back book of these agreements will be affected, and there'll be lots of remediation projects up and running in the next 18 months. So we can foresee a bit of a shortage in the next 18 months of that resource, and whether that then impacts the cost of that may present a bit of a risk to the delivery of some projects. There's a couple of ways to mitigate that. So an alternative that we have available is an offshore solutions. We have a base in South Africa that has experienced resources available to be deployed at a reduced cost. Another strategy firms that maybe haven't started preparation yet is around taking a look at their policies and procedures and understanding the suitability of the detail behind it. Obviously, the detail behind the redress scheme is yet to be confirmed, but work can be done to bring some of those complaint handling practices up to date. Having robust and thorough policies will mean that businesses are able to scale their operations much faster, and potentially be able to use less experienced resources if those resources are supported by strong, detailed procedures to help them make the right decision.
Wow. Thanks, Mike. On the back of that then, so if I kind of hand back to Gary, in terms of what motor finance creditors need to do now, what is the kind of TCC recommended approach and timings from here?
Yeah, so just before I get onto that, I guess the most important overriding factor I would give people, especially those on the call who have been involved in big past business reviews in the past, is really challenge where you're starting from, hope for the best, plan for the worst, and verify the integrity of your data. And if the FCA goes back to 2007, I think many of us will start to question the integrity or even the existence of information going back that far. So I was going to go on and just talk about what you're looking for, which is cases which involve discretionary commission, cases with high commission levels, determining disclosure practices of firms of distribution, how the disclosure was commissioned, e.g. did they simply disclose it existed versus what might be received. We don't know what the relevance of that is going to be going forward, whether they need to disclose quantum to get past that particular hurdle. So I would be looking to data mine as far back as you can, get some general sense of comfort, and then start getting into tranches or buckets, as we say in Yorkshire, of how comfortable you are with your data, and taking into account any distribution arrangements to dealers, whether they were consistent with the scope of service they set out to the consumer and indeed to you. I think someone just raised the question about vulnerability. Will CMC start manipulating the customers to make them sound like they are vulnerable? Well, they may do, but going back to where we started from earlier, the FCA consultation should hopefully take into account considerations of vulnerability and whether or not some of those claims were vexatious versus sophisticated and all the bits in between. So possibly, no doubt they will try, if they are allowed to even get involved. So there are a number of things you should be getting on with now, but overall, data mine as much as you possibly can and just see what you think you're starting with and go from there.
Thanks, Gary. So I guess if I look to summarise kind of where we got to, I think the remediation and redress environment is muddier and more complicated than we thought it was going to be. And I think as a result of that, there's an awful lot of information that's up in the air, and clarity is not going to be known for a while yet. However, that isn't a reason not to do anything. As has been called out, there's going to be a resource challenge for these projects. And if there's going to be a resource challenge, then the people who get out there first with their RFPs are the ones who get those resources. So getting yourself prepared is going to be really key in order to be kind of finishing this process quickly and effectively. And data is going to be a core part of that. Understanding your populations, getting the data for everything from your relationships with your kind of dealers and dealerships and brokers, and right the way through to what information do you hold on customers going back all the way to 2007, which is going to be a challenge. But if you can get that and your policies and your processes set up effectively, you're going to be in the best possible place in order to take this forward. That's about all we wanted to cover here today. We have got a couple of questions that I think we can go to now. Gary talked a bit about the vulnerable customers piece. Mike, have you got anything to add on the vulnerable customers piece from the CMCs?
Yeah, I suppose just to add to what Gary has said, in terms of whether they would pivot, we are already seeing it in terms of some of our existing clients where complaints around affordability and irresponsible lending are being sort of buried within the DCA complaint, and that is outside of the pause. So that is an activity, again, if firms have got complaints sitting waiting, it would be a good exercise to start triaging those and looking at those. So the CMCs have already pivoted, and we're seeing it with some of our clients.
Fab. Thanks, Mike. We had another question, and it might be a little bit harsh to throw this out at you guys because it's quite a difficult one, but a question around the wider implications in relation to payment of commissions. Do we have a view on how far-reaching this could be, to whom and to the impact? And I suppose for me, this is more about, originally when we were going through the Supreme Court ruling, there was talk about this isn't limited to motor finance. If it's non-DCA, then actually the whole kind of consumer credit space is up for grabs. Given what they've stated, what do you think the potential implications are for kind of broadening this out to other parts of financial services, and kind of how incentivized and motivated do you think the FCA are of actually doing that?
Who do you want to answer first?
Whoever would like to.
All right. From memory, wasn't it discussed and articulated? intentionally avoiding that very question because it had come up in the junior court. It's very hard to understand how the court can set out some very prescriptive what might contribute.
Gary, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if it works very well. Your microphone's playing up. I tell you what we'll do. We will collate Gary's answer and we will put that back in an email afterwards. Mike, did you have a view on any of that?
Yeah, I would default to Gary's opinion in terms of the wider ranging of impacts of that. So I think it's best if Gary can collate his response, that'd be great.
Yeah, fabulous. I mean, and whilst it's not a desperately educated one, my personal opinion is that the FCA aren't particularly motivated to do this at the moment. The government put quite a lot of pressure on the FCA to limit things down, and so they're not looking for opportunities to take this further. I think what will be interesting is whether the CMCs find an angle, and if the CMCs find an angle to go after, then I think that will kind of push the FCA one way or the other. I think that draws us to a close today. Between us, TCC, Momenta and Recordsure have the capability to help with any of your needs regarding this coming remediation programme, from advice through to technology and the specialist resource and outsourced managed services. So if you do wish to continue this conversation, or if you'd like a free consultation hour to test your thinking and plans, please do reach out to me. And if not, then I wish you a very nice afternoon. Thank you very much.